This lecture is part of the West Indian Soldier Heritage Project, carried out in partnership with the National Army Museum and the National Lottery Heritage Fund. The 7 Years' War, seizing negotiating pieces in the Caribbean between 1756 and 1763. Arising from issues left unresolved after the War of the Austrian Succession, territorial disputes between Austria and Prussia, and rivalry between the French and British in India and North America, the 7 Years' War was fought on multiple continents and is a strong candidate for being defined as the first true World War. The early years of the war saw very little occur in the Caribbean, but Secretary of State and member of the Cabinet William Pitt the Elder turned his mind towards the West Indies following the successful capture of Louisbourg, Nova Scotia, in 1758. The success at Louisbourg had been something of a rarity, and the war had largely not been going in Britain's favour. A victory in the West Indies would have been useful from a political standpoint. In addition to being useful in domestic politics, the capture of a valuable French Caribbean island, such as Martinique, may have forced the French to the table to negotiate a peace, and, if not, would prove to be a useful bartering piece in any such future discussion. William Beckford, a wealthy Jamaican planter who represented the City of London as an MP and was also elected Lord Mayor of London on 2 separate occasions, assured Pitt that Martinique could be taken with both a small force and a good commander. Many military minds were not convinced by these assurances and lobbied for an increase in the number of men. Thus, instead of the original estimate of 4,000 men, in the end a force of around 7,000 was assembled from the 3rd and 4th Regiments of Foot, the 42nd Foot, the Highlanders, and men from the 38th Foot, who were still stationed in the Leeward Islands on what was the longest overseas posting in the entire history of the British Army. The force was under the command of Major General Peregrine Thomas Hopson, with Colonel John Barrington as second in command. Their instructions were to capture Martinique and, if this proved impossible, to capture Guadeloupe. They first arrived at Barbados on the 3rd of January 1759, having finally left England on the 12th of November 1758. The invasion force arrived at Fort Royal, Martinique, modern-day Fort de France, on the 15th of January 1759. After successfully neutralising 2 gun batteries at Negro Point, the army was able to land on the 16th before setting up camp for the night. The next day, the British attempted to advance against the French defenders, who in return attacked the British position. These defenders made excellent use of the terrain, especially the thick jungle, and the British came under heavy fire whilst being unable to locate their enemy. Certain practical difficulties in assaulting the main stronghold thus presented themselves. The heavy musket fire from the French militia and the density of the terrain rendered the task of drawing the necessary cannons close enough to the French fortifications for attack near impossible. There would also have been significant difficulty in carrying the necessary water supplies for the attackers. There was no landing site closer to Fort Royal itself, and the fortifications were too high for the fleet to bombard from the sea. In light of these difficulties, a council of war decided to withdraw, and the troops were re-embarked on the evening of the 17th, with nearly 100 men having been either killed or wounded since the morning. The fleet sailed up the coast to the town of Saint-Pierre, and shots were exchanged with the fortifications there, but it was decided not to land, as capturing this town would not have forced the French to surrender. Thus the fleet decided to continue to the secondary target, Guadeloupe. The fleet arrived on the morning of the 23rd of January to begin bombardment of Fort St. Charles near Basse-Terre, succeeding in setting fire to the town. Eventually, both the fortress's garrison and the inhabitants of the town fled, and the army was able to land unopposed on the morning of the 24th. The French had retreated to Dodin, a position in the mountains which could not easily be attacked due to the terrain. The French governor refused to surrender, and thus a new strategy was required, but it was not adopted until the middle of February due to Hopson's stubbornness. In the meanwhile, large numbers of soldiers fell sick due to dysentery, and over 2,000 had to be transported to Antigua, where fortunately most of them recovered, albeit slowly. This reduced the effective numbers of troops to around 3,300. Hopson himself also fell sick. Whilst Hopson was ill, Commodore Moore of the Navy took the initiative, and a British force composed of sailors, marines and Highlanders successfully captured Fort Louis near Pointe-à-Pitre, which gave the British a base with which they could launch operations on either island of Guadeloupe. Hopson died of fever on the 27th of February, and command of the expedition thus fell to Barrington, who quickly moved to carry out offensive operations as the number of men available for duty continued to decrease due to disease. Commodore Moore requested 300 soldiers in order to fill out his ship's companies, which he needed as word arrived of a French fleet that had been sighted nearby. Despite this loss, Barrington still had 1,200 healthy regulars, as well as 350 volunteers and 300 slaves from Antigua, Nevis and Montserrat. On the 27th of March, Colonel Crump was sent with 600 men to the south coast of Grande Terre and successfully attacked the towns of St. Anne and St. Francois. Barrington himself led a sortie to Gosier, and then forced his way back to Fort Louis via the land route, managing to disrupt a French attack. Operations continued into April, where between the 12th and 21st, a force under Brigadier John Clavering proceeded to Arnaudville and successfully captured Maho Bay, where the French had been receiving military supplies from the Dutch island of St. Eustatius. Clavering continued to pursue the French, whilst Crump and his men arrived at Maho Bay and rendezvoused with Clavering at Petit Bourg. On the 18th of April, they marched to Sainte Marie, successfully overwhelming the local militia before entering the district of Cap-Sterre on the 19th, home to Guadeloupe's most valuable sugar plantations. In light of these successes, the principal residents of the islands sent a deputation, who by the 1st of May had agreed to articles of capitulation with Barrington. Barrington made these terms generous to the French, as he knew that sickness amongst his men would only intensify during the summer. In total, the action on Guadeloupe was believed to have seen 59 killed and 149 wounded in action, whilst over 800 were lost to disease. The action on Guadeloupe also saw the later capitulation of Marie-Galante, the Saints, Petite Terre and Desirade, and these conquests were welcomed in London. This victory, coupled with other successes elsewhere in the war, led 1759 to be named an Annus Mirabilis, a wonderful year, and was arguably the most significant year of the entire 7 Years' War. However, there were further military actions and successes by the British in the later years of the war, particularly in the Caribbean. The Navy also saw several engagements, and the Army produced its own triumphs. A small force successfully captured Dominica, forcing a French surrender on the 7th of June 1761, after landing a mere day before, yet even more significant actions were to follow. Another attack was made on Martinique in 1762, this time with an army of around 14,000 men, twice the size of the one in 1759, including 11 regiments, as well as both volunteers and slaves from Antigua and Barbados. It also proved to be the most complex operation attempted in the Caribbean to date. With the fleet under the command of Admiral Rodney, and the army under the command of General Monckton, the force arrived at Martinique in January 1762, with the whole army successfully landed without loss at Casanavir on the 16th. Fort Royal was a march of several miles away through a terrain of deep gullies and ravines. The French, learning several months earlier of a possible attack, had fortified their position. The British, in order to overcome these defences, had to construct gun batteries to neutralise the French's own guns before they advanced. This was done by the 24th, and a general attack was initiated which forced the French back off their defences at Mont-Torteson towards Fort Royal and Mont-Grenier. The British began preparing for an attack on Fort Royal and successfully repelled an attack from Mont-Grenier and seized the latter position on the 28th. Fort Royal capitulated on the 3rd of February, and Monckton's army was able to reduce the rest of the island within the space of 9 days, completing the invasion. The success at Martinique was, however, a prelude to an even greater military triumph a few months later, the siege of Havana, Cuba. The force sent to Havana comprised over 12,000 men under Lieutenant General George Keppel, the 3rd Earl of Albemarle, comprised of 22 infantry regiments, artillery and engineers, including some of the men from the army that Monckton had commanded on Martinique. The fleet arrived off the coast of Havana on the 6th of June 1762, taking the Spanish by surprise. This initial surprise could not, however, be exploited to its fullest potential, as high winds and surf prevented an initial landing at a spot east of the city, but it was carried out the next day without opposition or a single loss of life. The British were able to advance from their initial position without resistance and began to build batteries on the heights overlooking the city. Routes to the beaches were secured, with sailors bringing up the necessary supplies, military stores and cannon. The batteries took some time to build, and the Spanish attempted a counterattack on the 29th of June, which was successfully repulsed by the British. On the 1st of July, the first battery opened fire on El Morro Castle, Havana's main defensive fortification, and, with the aid of cannon fire from the fleet, succeeded in reducing the castle's operational guns to just 2. Slowly but surely the British began to approach El Morro, with engineers building siege lines to start undermining the high walls. The Spanish made another sortie on the 22nd of July, but were again driven back after suffering heavy losses. Reinforcements from Britain's North American colonies arrived on the 27th of July, which were welcome as the old threat of disease had begun to take its toll on the British Army, which had left too few troops to operate all the batteries. On the 30th, a mine under the walls of Fort Morro was detonated, and the castle was captured by storm with minimal loss. New batteries were readied by the 10th of August and opened fire the next day, disabling Fort Puntal, Havana's other main defensive fortification, leading to the Spanish governor, Juan de Prado, to send out a flag of truce. Terms were negotiated, and the Spanish officially surrendered on the 13th of August, 1762, after a 65-day siege. The news of victory in Havana led to celebration across Britain when it arrived. Control of Havana granted the British control over the main passage out of the Caribbean and back to Europe on the trade winds. However, Albemarle's army was now very sick from disease, with one brigade comprised of 4 regiments apparently unable to field 20 men fit for duty between them. The situation was such that Albemarle was unable to send 8,000 troops to join the assault on French Louisiana, as had originally been part of the overall British strategy. Nor could he send the North American troops back to their homeland, as it would have made garrisoning the captured city impossible. Although the army had lost less than 1,000 men through the siege, either by virtue of being wounded or killed in action, by the 18th of October they had buried over 5,000 due to loss from disease. The 7 Years' War concluded with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. As per its original intentions, Britain was able to use its conquests in the Caribbean as bargaining chips, retaining only Dominica. During the negotiations, it was able to secure the return of British territories like Minorca, which had been seized by the French, as well as forcing the French to recognise British dominion of various other territories, including parts of India, but most notably Canada. From a military perspective, the British campaign in the Caribbean during the 7 Years' War was a large success. Not only had they achieved their aims in securing these negotiating chips, but the British had learned to effectively combine army and naval operations to successfully attack their targets. This would also be demonstrated in the later wars of the century, including the French Revolutionary Wars. For more information about this topic, as well as the history and heritage of the Caribbean and the work of the West India Committee, please visit us at westindiacommittee.org. Thank you.